And let's begin. Cry with full throat, without restraint, Isaiah 58 says. Raise your voice like a ram's horn. Declare to my people their transgression, to the house of Jacob their sin. To be sure, they seek me daily, eager to learn my ways, like a nation that does what is right, that has not abandoned the laws of its God. They ask me for the right way. They are eager for the nearness of God. Why, when we fasted, did you not see? When we starved our bodies, did you pay no heed? Why? Because on your fast days you see to your business and oppress all your laborers, because you fast in strife and contention, and you strike with a wicked fist. Your fasting today is not such as to make your voice heard on high. Is such the fast I desire? A day for men and women to starve their bodies? Is it bowing the head like a bulrush and lying in a sackcloth and ashes? Do you call that a fast? A day when the Lord is favorable? No, this is the fast I desire. To unlock fetters of wickedness and untie the cords of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, to break off every yoke. It is to share your bread with the hungry and to take the wretched poor into your home. When you see the naked, to clothe them and not to ignore your own kin. What does it mean to be a Jew? What does it mean to live a Jewish life? We certainly know that the dichotomy between ritual and ethics is unnecessary. We know that the prophets weren't asking us to reduce all of Judaism to the ethical. But they were saying that without the ethical, your Judaism is not sufficient. That if something is necessary, it is to live a life of value. That's what it means to be a Jew. Judaism is not some startup nation. Jewish pride is not the enumeration of how many Nobel Prizes we've won. To be a Jew is to connect to the core of what living a life of value. After 67 and 50 years later, this is one of the most difficult questions that we face here in the state of Israel. And it's one of the most difficult questions that supporters of Israel face. Because can I bring my values to the conversation? Can I bring my ethical aspirations? Or in some context of advocacy and feeling attacked by enemies of Israel, that there is no place for me to bring this forward, because the minute I allow some values discourse, what I'm in essence allowing is the legitimacy of those who want to undermine my existence. And so when I want to talk about Israel, let me talk about Startup Nation. Let me talk to you about all the technological things, because if I'm going to talk about the values, I can't compete in a values discourse. I can't. And do you know how many students I meet who tell me the reason why I go to JVP is because that's the only place that I could have a Jewish values conversation. They're at least willing to talk. Is that who we want to be? Our voice is clear and loud about the Kotel. What is our voice about occupation? What is our voice about our moral responsibility to non-Jews, to Palestinians who are living under our control? Whether as citizens or, as you learned from Tal, as people living under occupation as a technical legal term, not as a moral pejorative term, as a technical legal term by which it means land captured in war. Are we frightened from that conversation? I would ask, what happens? Are we a Jewish people if we're frightened from that conversation? Are we a Jewish people if we don't speak out about who it is that we ought to be? Or are we intimidated by donors, members? Could I talk? Now I want to clarify, and I think I've said this before. This I Engage 4 curriculum is the first curriculum in the I Engage series which does not presuppose the self-evidency of the two-state solution. All other curriculum, in particular the third, presuppose that we are trying to create a shared values discourse amongst all those who advocate for a two-state solution. We realized as we are moving forward that we can't do that anymore. For two reasons. The first is that the one-state solution, which used to be primarily the ideology of the anti-Zionist left, has now become an integral part of the Zionist right. In its most radical forms, it grows out of a sense of the holiness of the land. But even amongst center-right, a deep sense that Palestinian society and leadership want me dead has caused more and more Israelis to simply not think anymore about the two-state solution. Even if it was, it's just not peace now. I don't even know what you're talking about. And if there is nobody, and if after now, 15 years, or in particular since 2005 and the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza, over and over again people argue or feel very, very deeply, not in our lifetime. And you heard, Micha's positing of this challenge. So then what do? Number one, we can't assume that we, in any sense of we, agree on the self-evidency of the two-state solution. Those of you who are familiar with my work on boundaries, please remember you cannot have a society, cannot have a definition of something that is intolerably deviant if a large segment of its society adopts it. And just as intermarriage has become an integral part of who Jews are, I'm not saying you should perform intermarriages, and I'm not saying it's a good thing for the Jewish people. And all of that, that's someone else's debate. But de facto, we are an intermarried people. And you can't have a category of intolerable deviance. Just like you can't define homosexuality as some psychological disease. The social reality shapes your categories and shapes what it is that you feel you have to talk about and how you see people. And over time, what you see expands, and over time, how you see people expands. moral people, decent people, people who love Israel and who love humankind and feel morally responsible, are no longer advocating the two-state solution. And that requires all of us to ask, who are we, and how do we create a discussion that's not defined solely in terms of one state, two state? Is there something that, regardless of whether you're one state, two state, all of us can agree upon? How do we be Jewish if being Jewish is to be a people of moral value in the midst of a reality in which it is not self-evident that I can live and still allow the national flourishing of another people? It's not put it this way, even I'm a two-statist, but it behooves everyone, regardless of your position, to recognize that regardless of that position, that you're not certain about it. And that it's not self-evident, it's not simple. How, another way of stating this, and I believe this is one of the greatest difficulties. 50 years after 67, now living in 217. In 67, we learned how to survive in the Middle East. 67 was the turning point in which our survival was no longer a question. We made it. We made it. If anyone was going to survive, our survival was more certain. It's always tenuous, but more certain than anybody around us. Our nation state was going to thrive more than anybody else's. 50 years later, that is even more correct. But 50 years later, the fundamental question that we face is not how to survive in the Middle East, but how not to become of the Middle East. And your neighborhood brings you down. And it's very easy to talk about certain principles and certain values and certain aspirations and why can't you trust? And one of the fundamental assumptions of a moral universe is that you're living in a moral universe. Is that when you speak value, someone else here, hello, how are you? Is responded with fine, thank you, and you. You first. No, you first. Okay, that's pushing it. There is assumptions that we're all going to be Kantian in some form and will act in such a way that we're willing for our behavior to be universalizable. That we all recognize that ethics is not the same as self-interest. And that even though you use the language, the minute you enter into a moral discourse, you're entering into something that might obligate you and consequently require of you to diminish or to lessen some of that which you might define as your immediate self-interest. There's a lot of things you could assume. Almost none of them could we assume in our neighborhood today. Almost none of them. Now, can we still hold on to something? How do we survive this neighborhood, but not become and allow our society to be defined by moral principles that our neighborhood seems to allow or even assume and take as self-evident? In the Middle East, what is defined as a functioning country? The standards are really low. When is a country in default? Just so you should know, if Assad comes back in power, Syria officially returns to the status of a functioning country. The trains will run. Now, in that environment, how do you talk about ethics? How do you maintain it? Everything that I'm going to speak about today is a prayer. It's a prayer. And it's a prayer to fellow educators. Because it's our job to make sure that we do. Because if we don't, the victory of 67 will have been for naught. For naught. But I don't know, and it's not self-evident to me, how to do so. I know we have to try, but success is not self-evident. I know who I want to be, but can I be who I want to be? One of the ways in which we start this exercise is let's talk more about who we want to be. And for those of you who know me for many years, the greatest joy in my life, okay, that's a little exaggeration, but I have many greatest joys, and grandchildren first. But one of the greatest joys in my life in learning is chazara. I love going back. I love going back and thinking again and reconnecting again. And I want to suggest to you that our people need a chazara about the basic foundations of our moral fiber as a people. We are clear about them when we speak about ourselves individually. We are no longer clear about it when we speak about the political reality of Israel. We are certainly not clear about it in our speeches, in our communication, in our public voices. How do lovers of Israel, people for whom, those who want to destroy us, you are my enemy, I don't have any problem. People for whom Israel is the only country in the world which morally fails, I'm not even interested in having a conversation with you. I'm not interested in convincing those who have a distorted anti-Semitic perspective on Israel that I'm a nice boy. I don't even care. This is not about public relations. This is about us. Us. Are we talking or have we been silenced? Do we know how to talk in a way that doesn't vilify a major part of our community? Do we know how to talk in a way that doesn't assume certain political positions as being the only ones which are moral? It's great. I love it when I am the enlightened moral human being. I love it even doubly when I'm the most moral. Let's give that up. And I said it before, and I'm saying it again, and I want to tell you I say it almost every single day to every single group that I meet. Use these words. Good people, moral people, intelligent people, lovers of Israel can have different political positions on what Israel should do in Judea and Samaria and how we politically respond to the challenges of 67. Every single day say it. And then there's a chance that we as a people could begin to find a different shared narrative. Not a shared narrative of political answers, but a shared narrative of what all of us ought to aspire for. And any time you create a notion of a shared narrative, anytime you create red lines, there are going to be people outside of those red lines. Not only is that not a problem, if the red lines are done correctly, it's a requirement. But it requires of you to see the possibility of the intelligence, depth, and moral considerations of the other. It's about creating a different type of community, not divided between red and blue and left and right, but something in which your soul is a little bigger. And today I want to speak about what that might be and the challenges we face in creating it. But let's also recognize that we, again, it's very important. Our tradition always speaks about chatati, aviti, pashati, dibarti, dofi. It always, the whole purpose of learning purpose of learning is not to reaffirm your prior self-evident truths. The purpose of learning is to sit down and to say, Gadol Talmud shemevi lidei maaseh, what do I need to do? What do I need to do better? What do I need to do more? When am I silent? When have I been intimidated? I don't want us to be prophetic, but we need some of the moral clarity. And that must be a part of our conversation post-67. Because the reality is, there are roughly 5.5 to 6 million Palestinians living between the Jordan and the Mediterranean. And our issue is not merely what will constitute a democratic state. The issue is, how do we see people? What are our moral principles? What are the differences between Gaza, Judea and Samaria, Israeli Arab Palestinians, refugees? How do we think about this question? We didn't come home to a land without a people. We might have been a people without a land, but we came home to a land with at the time hundreds of thousands and now millions of people for whom there is one self-evident truth. Our coming home was not the fulfillment of their tikva. Wasn't. Should it have been? Should it not have been? Should they be more happy than anyone else? Are they the happiest Arabs in the world? All of the above is possible. But us here, we aren't their dream come true. And what do we do in the midst of this neighborhood? The first is that we have to reaffirm a self-evident truth, I wish, within our tradition. And that is that it is not Jews who were created in the image of God, but all human beings who were created in the image of God. That when we see somebody, whether they are a fellow citizen, a refugee, a Palestinian in Judea and Samaria, a terrorist, whether we see a Muslim or a Christian, life's value is not exhausted by your religious and national identification with the Jewish people. So simple, but very, very difficult. Challenged by two key forces, one within our tradition and one within the reality of the Middle East that we're living in today. The first is that one of the ideas developed within the category of chosenness is Atem Kruim Adam. You are called a person. They're not called a person. Oh, as you saw, they're not animals. They're more people than animals. So when I'm saying Jew, non-Jew, animals, I might use the word Adam to refer to the non-Jew. I might. Because they're more people than non-people. But you are the full people, and they are not the full people. You thought you were going to keep Jews out of the Temple Mount by building a cemetery in front of the gate where the Messiah is supposed to come. You thought you were going to outsmart me because the Messiah would not be able to walk through and we wouldn't be able to get to the temple because we have there now a Muslim cemetery? We're called Adam. You're not called Adam. You don't even, your tmemet is not tameh. Your met is not tameh. You don't have, your death doesn't create impurity. Because Atem Kruim Adam. There is something, and this regardless of your neighborhood, there is something about certain ideas within our tradition that are corrected by the mere fact that we are living in the midst of other people, which do not get corrected when you have the myth that no one else is watching. There's something that happens to Judaism when we experience being a minority. And even more so when we experience being a beloved minority. And then all of a sudden, we don't read this one. We go to the Gemara on page 17, on page 19, because it's debated. Page 19, Asher yaseh otam ha'adam v'chai behem, Kohanim, Levim, v'Yisrael lo ne'emar, ela adam halamata shafilu goy v'osek b'Torah, harehu kekohen gadol. We all come with our sources. Adam was created in the image of God. Eve was created in the image of God. Abraham first starts in 12, and that does not undermine the fundamental value that all human life has. But when you're in your own community and you don't think anybody's watching, some of the natural self-corrective selection that happens between which verse you read and which verse you don't. And I gave you intentionally the Tfus Vilna incorrect version on page 2 of the Mishnah. Fixed it in English, didn't fix it in Hebrew. You noticed. And I want you to know the experience of hearing this text. Tfus Vilna says, Kol ha-metzil, or Kol ha-ma'abed nefesh achat mi Yisrael. Now that's an absolute. It's not what was written in the manuscripts. It makes no sense within the Mishnah. But you don't even notice it. You're not even aware that oops, because it wouldn't dawn on somebody in a minority or as a beloved minority to think in those terms. Or it's sobering to hear when you read the Rambam just simply list, who do you be mechalel Shabbos over? On source 4, who are you a mechalel Shabbos over? We have a technical issue that anytime you have something that's kavua, kol ha-poresh minag, anybody who separates themselves from that which is fixed is still part of the fixed. But if the fixed move, then whoever separates themselves from the fixed, it depends on the majority of the fixed. And therefore, if there's a fixed community in which the majority are non-Jews, and there is some minority of Jews, and somebody moves from the fixed to another space, and they get buried by an avalanche, on Shabbos, we uncover those stones because it might be a Jew. But if they're moving, now we're talking about a majority. In the case of a majority, since there's a majority chance that he might be a non-Jew, we don't. The halachic, the internal halachic cohesion and argument. What happens when a people learn these texts? By the way, a problem that confronts North American Jews much less, because they learn less. What happens when one of the greatest challenges of the state of Israel is the fact that we have a more successful Jewish education? One, how do we reclaim the centrality of this category? And reclaim it over and again, knowing fully well that it is not self-evident that this will be implemented. It's not self-evident that it is understood. But there is a second challenge that we face here in Israel. Beyond the isolation, the potential corrective forces of being a beloved minority. The second challenge of Israel is not merely the fact that we are a majority, but that we are living in a war zone. One of the fundamental principles of war is that it is the only place where it is morally legitimate to take a life. That's what war is. War is where you're allowed to kill. Not even allowed to kill, you might even be morally obligated to kill. War is a space where the fundamental value of human life is put in suspension. A soldier is allowed to kill. This is the only place where human beings are allowed to take other human beings' lives. Now, in the past, you could distinguish between soldier and non-soldier, between combatant and non-combatant. You go to war and you're standing on your hill and I'm standing on your hill and I'm going bzz, bzz, bzz. And I don't know, whoever dies more and first loses. And then you move forward. And you're standing there and we attack each other. Part of asymmetrical war, the Middle East, and now also within other societies, is that there isn't a battlefield. The war zone includes your home. Now, soldiers are trained. Soldiers, the way military works, is putting forth an ethical principle, but not counting on the soldier to connect to their ethical principle, but counting on the soldier to be disciplined enough that through ongoing training, there's certain things that you don't do. One of the reasons, for example, even though there are so many weapons in Israeli society and there are so few weapon deaths, is when you go through the army, you don't point there's certain things you don't point your gun. You don't discharge it unnecessarily. You don't even have to get to. You don't even get to, is it dangerous, not dangerous? Part of military training is to drill something into your consciousness when you are exhausted, so that you will never forget, so that when it comes to act, you don't have to actually bring forth this great moral issue. There's things you just don't do. But what happens when people leave the military? And now, all of society is in a war zone. The military ethic is very clear. The IDF code, if you notice, does not say that we have to protect human life. They couldn't say you have to protect human life because as a soldier, you are responsible to take human life. You are, however, responsible to protect the dignity of human life. How do we speak about your moral responsibility to life? By creating guidelines under which you limit your killing power. You limit your killing power by A, making sure that you only kill in self-defense. And again, it's a mantra. You only kill to the extent that is proportioned to the danger, and you do everything in your power to avoid civilian and prisoner of war casualties, including endangering your own life. Israeli society today, the military, in the last years, something remarkable happened. You might know this, and if you don't, you have to file it away. In Israeli society today, there is a fundamental schism between the majority of the senior officers in the army and the majority of the senior leaders of Israeli society as to whether the code of ethics of the army needs to be replaced. And the chief of staff is branded a Sonei Yisrael because he wants to stand by this code of ethics. Now, where does it get even more complicated? With Sergeant Azaria, the ethic of Israeli society of not firing on people outside of a moment of self-defense and outside, disproportionate to the moment, and especially when the event stopped, is firmly ingrained in Israeli practice and in everyday life. Soldiers do not discharge their weapons, and even more, it's interesting. In general, there is no population who has more automatic weapons and which is in constant danger and which knows from 0 degree of separation people who have been killed and who have ostensibly an ideology which would justify the use of force than settlers. And the number of settlers who have unjustly discharged their weapons is, who's the second Baruch Goldstein? So there might be a second. You can't tell me the fifth. We don't shoot. We might do other things. But here comes the second extension to the challenge of the value of human life. Our research team recently developed a whole paper, which if you want, we're going to translate it to English, on the limits of self-defense in a civil society in the context of terror attacks. I just asked Abi Sagi to add another chapter to his paper. Because what we're discovering is that while we don't dispense our weapons by and large unjustly, we're not providing aid and assistance to people after they've been shot. And as I said to you, everybody asks about Sergeant Azaria. What about the 11 minutes? Why wasn't he given aid? Why wasn't he treated? Is that who we want? If this is a human life, and if a human being is somebody, regardless, which you have to give them aid, this is a life. It's creating the image of God. Why aren't we offering aid? Why are the medics standing around? Why just 3 or 4 weeks ago, when a 16-year-old girl tried to stab an Israeli soldier near Beit El, and she was shot, nobody questioned whether the shooting was legitimate. Israeli soldiers know exactly when to use their weapons and do so just fine. Nobody's dying on the sanctity of purity of arms. The purpose of purity of arms is to make sure that you use your arms in a pure way. No one was questioning. There is a video of a group of soldiers and individuals standing around this 16-year-old girl, cursing her as she's bleeding to death. Die, you bleep. F, you bleep. A curse be on you. Die, die, die. The army investigates the actions, discovers that there's no proof that it was the soldiers who were saying this, and therefore it's not a military issue. Why wasn't she treated? It's very hard to commit to the sanctity of human life in the midst of war. And it's very hard to commit to the sanctity of life in the midst of a society which you feel wants you dead. But because it's hard, doesn't mean it's necessary. And that's one of the reasons why, many of you know this, and somebody asked me this, so what do we do now? In the act of repairing Israeli society, in the act of asking who do we want to be, we have to check who are those non-Jews who we don't have cause and grounds to say you want me killed. Because part of what happens is there's an infection. It goes from the West Bank to Israeli Arabs, it goes from Israeli Arabs to refugees. It's one of the reasons why I started this refugee daycare center for the Institute. What, I had nothing else to do? What, you don't love the Jews? Because what could be, if you don't see a refugee as a human being, then where are you? And I'm not saying that you have to give citizenship, all of the above. Check it out, find out, do they warrant refugee status? If you as a Jew do not see a refugee as a human being, then who bleep are you? And then what does it mean to have a Jewish state? If you don't see Israeli, Palestinian Arabs as human beings, who you don't only fund, because in your economic calculation, Israel has a gold mine that no other country in the world does. You know what Israel's gold mine is? We have approximately 30% of our society who are underemployed, not because of the economic viability and the ability to stretch our economy, but not because of their intellectual abilities or their work culture, none of the above. They're ready. Just if you add a certain level of additional education and you create a little more opportunity, you will be able to increase your GNP by 30%, almost overnight or within a decade. No country. The whole European Union, one of the secrets is they don't have anybody there. They're all gone. There is a zero birth rate. There's nothing. Your stagnation is built in to them. And that's why refugees is not only a moral agenda, it's an economic necessity. Because you don't even have a workforce. Go to Eastern European countries outside of the tourist season, summer, they're empty. We have a 30% of our society educated, wanting to work. If we just enabled certain growth. I don't want you just to give a 15 billion shekel package to Israeli Arabs because it's going to come back to you in spades. If we fix that, then there's a chance that our foreign policy will look differently. But when Israeli society, because of the environment and because of our ideology, slowly but surely undermines the centrality of human life, and a non-Jewish life does not matter the same as a Jewish life, then you are violating principle number one of what every single Jew, regardless of whether you're one state or two states, has to commit to. Two, the right to property. All of you in the United States are familiar. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all human beings are created equal. I'm a rabbi, we interpret. That all human beings, because it's, of course, we'll get to this in a moment, that all human beings are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And probably based on Locke and others, one of the fundamental definitions of a human society is that the issue is not merely the sanctity of life, but the ability of a human being to pursue their interests, to pursue the happiness that they and their family deserve. And that is intimately connected to your ability to hold property, to preserve your property, and to be protected from others taking your property. Jewish tradition has an inordinate amount of laws pertaining to property. Inordinate. And as you saw, part of the central obligation of a Jew is not only to not damage somebody else's property. That's easy. Not self-evident that you don't steal someone's property. But that when somebody's property is in danger, or when somebody's property is being is somehow disconnected for them, or they're in a moment where they're facing potential loss, as a moral human being, you do not see somebody else's loss as the moment for your potential gain. But that when somebody is facing a loss, Your responsibility is to reconnect them back to their property. Your responsibility to their property and to them is to be part of a solution. That means you have to control your self-interest. Here it is. It's right there. The goat, the donkey, the diamond, the money. It's right there. The taiva is there. It's mine for the taking. They're not there. Finders, keepers, losers, weepers. You're not there. This was my moment. Who knows? Maybe even God made it. Why am I getting it? Because look, God's looking out for me. The temptation is there. And our tradition says, Lo tuchal lehit'alem. And that Lo tuchal lehit'alem is not just lehit'alem from a person, but it's to Lo tuchal lehit'alem from their property. Now, who does this apply to? In Deuteronomy, it applies to achicha, to your brother. In Exodus, it says, sonacha, your enemy. And as you saw in the Mechilta, who is your enemy? In the Tanaic, at the Tanaic level, there is a debate. By the time of the Moraim, there already is no debate. In the Tanaic level, at the Tanaic period, Sonacha could include the Akum, the idol worshiper. It might also mean just someone who's Sonacha could mean the sinning Jew, or it could mean just somebody who was mean to you. All of the above are legitimate interpretations, and the Mechilta adds, one of them includes the possibility of non-Jew, and therefore the requirement of returning lost property applies to Jew and non-Jew alike. The challenge, by the Amoraic period, the dominant position is now that Sonacha is Yisrael. And as you saw, Amar Rav Bibi Bar Gidal, Amar Rabbi Shimon Chasida on page 12, Gezel Goy Asur, Aveidato Muteret. That means I might not be able to steal, but I don't live in a world where I feel as equally responsible to their property. This issue used to be, in the context of 67, used to be a simple, self-evident issue in Israeli society. Israeli society never understood the Geneva Accord as prohibiting settlement of Jews in Judea and Samaria. Neither the government nor the Supreme Court ever accepted international law's position that these settlements were illegal. And as Tal outlined to you, whether it is the just claim, just war, just claim, just defense, just claim, just defense, and just war, just claim, just war, just defense, that we had grounds to settle. But there was one rule that since 67 we never violated. And that rule was that it is legitimate for us to settle in those spaces which were prior to that held by whoever was controlling Judea and Samaria. And since they don't have a better claim than ours, our settlements at least are legitimate. No one has a superior claim. And that at the end, the status of Judea and Samaria will be resolved through negotiations, but in the meantime, settlements aren't illegal. The one rule that every Israeli government since 67 until a few months ago abided by is you do not build settlements on privately held land. And just as you cannot, when somebody is going through a checkpoint and you have to check their baggage, you can't open up their purse and take out their wallet. And I remember in the war in Lebanon when we were fighting, we didn't see any terrorists, and we were fighting Syrians the whole day. And two PLO people happened to enter into the battlefield, and they were taken captive. And some soldiers took their money. Those soldiers, in the middle of battle, were taken off of their tank and put in jail. We had one less tank to fight with, and we were losing lots of tanks, Lots of people were dying, and we needed people, and we said, you're not part of my army. You're not fighting, you don't, that was self-evident. A soldier who would open up and take, of course that's self-evident. So why is it that as of 3 months ago, Israel now officially allows the possibility of settlements on private land? Now, if you would argue, and this is where it gets complicated, if you would argue that it's necessary for survival, and it is a coherent argument to state that settlements are necessary for Israel's survival, I don't agree with it, but it is a coherent argument. There are 3,000 houses built on privately held land. Nobody could argue that these 3,000 houses, as distinct from the 150,000 other houses, are what's going to make the settlement movement plausible. You have no security argument. And Benny Begin, who is a one-statist, who for years is a one-statist and believes that it is impossible to have two states between the Jordan and gets up at the Knesset and says, today Israel's society has legitimized theft. And Israeli society is watching Survivor or The X Factor. 30 houses in Amona might seem like a minor issue. Our voice needs to be heard. And I don't care whether you're one state or two state. And I don't care whether you believe that the settlements are necessary. They are right. They're needed in the reality of the Middle East, whatever it is. Principle number 2 is non-Jewish property. They are people endowed with inalienable right to the pursuit of happiness, to have property, to own property. Or does the fact that taiva, it's a huge taiva. It's a huge taiva. We have the power. We have the power and everybody hates them anyway, so who gives a shit? Who really cares what Palestinians feel right now? And just like this, you cross a line. Just like this. And unfortunately, there are much voices within our tradition which allows it. So is our voice going to be heard on the Kotel, or is our voice going to be heard on Amona? And this has nothing to do with one state, two state. And this has nothing to do with BDS, and it has nothing to do with the United Nations. It has to do with us. The third principle that I believe has to be the cornerstone of a new consensus in Jewish life. And if you're not willing to live by it, just like if you don't believe a non-Jewish life has value, and just like you do not believe that those who aren't Jewish don't have a right to the pursuit of happiness and the holding of property. The third is the principle of reciprocity, which lies at the foundation of the way Jews do ethics. Way before Kant. Love your neighbor as yourself. Now it's a really complicated, we're so used to that translation. But the word is, ahavta le'reacha. Now it's interesting that Leviticus 19 does not assume that ahavta reacha includes whom? Includes the ger, and that's why it adds ahavta lo kamocha, by implication recognizing that reacha does not necessarily include the ger. Hillel teaches, what is hateful unto you, do not do unto others. Love that translation. The only problem is Hillel teaches us, man da'alayich sneh le chevrach al ta'avid. Chevrach. Who is your friend? As men, we never thought that re'acha and chevrach includes women. We had no problem saying what's hateful unto you, do not do unto others, but that doesn't apply to our wives or to girls, our children. It took history a while for us to recognize the moral responsibility of expanding who is Re'acha and who's Chavrach. It didn't include all human beings are endowed with inalienable rights as long as you are white, male, Christian, a whole list. Now, part of what's been happening, and this is one of the great challenges of Israeli society, is that we could go back in history to the more narrow applications of these categories. We are now living in a time when what's changed is not that which we know to be good. What's changed is the applications that we give to these categories. They're getting expanded. You can't do ethical discourse in 217 and compare yourself to the way the Australians dealt with the Aborigines and the way America dealt with the Indians. You can't do that. We're in another place. It's not sufficient for you to achieve moral excellence in 1732 terms, nor even in 1967 terms. The principle of reciprocity, that the way we as Jews act here is the way we would want others to act, has to be one of the most act towards us has to be one of the most fundamental moral categories and guidelines for Jewish political theory. That means that the critical date for 2017 is not 1967. The critical date is pre-State of Israel. It's 1930s, 1920s. It's the 18th century, the 17th century. We're not supposed to only love, we're also supposed to love a stranger. Now there are in our tradition, am she'itcha b'mitzvot. There are people who are limiting it. And the Bible understood probably that Re'acha did not include the non-Jew. That's why they gave the ger toshav. And then you can get into a halachic definition of who is the ger toshav, and then you're lost. Is reciprocity at the core of the way you think? Do we Jews who have power live with the constant consciousness of our moral standards of powerlessness? The obligation to reciprocity could save our souls. When that is self-evident, everything else becomes possible. When it's not, and it happens, and part of what we see throughout Western democracies today is that we assumed that our constitutions, our bills of rights, are going to protect us from crossing this line. That the framework for our application of reciprocity would be so simple. Act in such a way that you're willing for your behavior to be universalizable. Great, the universalizable is the world. Don't treat people as a means, but as an end. Simple. Are you a means or an end? In the midst of danger, in the midst of instability, none of our constitutions, none of our constitutional and legal protections are sufficient. And what the first thing to change is the application of the notion of reciprocity. It shrinks. And now it's Re'acha. Who's the good American? Who loves Jews? And the debate in Israel around Azariah in November and December as he was being tried was, do you love Jews or do you love them? And one of the worst manipulations of this was the application of the principle of we do not leave soldiers behind to Sergeant Azariah. You don't leave soldiers. It's one of the core features, as you all know, of Israeli society. It's one of the core features of Israeli military life. It's one of the reasons why it was self-evident to us to give 1,004 people back to get Gilad Shalit. You don't leave people behind. And I know this, I've told you, I remember literally in the war in Lebanon fighting, friends of mine dying, tanks next to me dying, because we were fighting to bring somebody who we thought were being captured. We were willing to die to bring people back. Of course we love Jews. Of course. There's a primacy of my responsibility to my people. But being willing to try Sergeant Azaria, or arguing against trying him because if I'm willing to try him, I'm leaving a soldier behind. That means if I ascribe moral failure or legal failure to one of my soldiers, I am leaving them behind. Who do you love more? Do we apply what's hateful unto you, do not do unto others, to that? To whom? Is it only to Sergeant Azaria? Because that's what they're saying. Don't leave. Would you want to be left behind? Would you want your son to be left behind? And therefore, if your son was guilty, did this, would you want him tried? Of course you wouldn't, therefore apply it. But who do we apply this to? Does it stop at Jewish life? We have to talk very, very clearly about reciprocity as the core foundations of the way we do Jewish. The fourth is the right to collective rights. We debated this very, very extensively in the I Engage team. We weren't sure whether to include it or not, because I don't want to include something within the moral red lines that a majority of people cannot accept, or a large segment of our people cannot accept. For some of us, the debate went on, that this right to collective rights is a direct consequence of the obligation of reciprocity. Now here we were aided by a paper written by Tal in the 90s, in which he states very clearly, or argues, that the fundamental right to self-determination is not a right to sovereignty. But it asks us as Israelis and as Jews, when we see Palestinians, are we still in 1917 and 1922 discourse? Both Balfour and the League of Nations, as you learned, clearly speaks about the rights of individual Arabs in Palestine. And it obligates the new Jewish state to take into account these rights. And that's why the Bill of Rights of 1940, it's individual rights. Palestinians did not have national rights. Did Palestinians see themselves as a people then, or not? Are they a byproduct of the Zionist narrative? Have they themselves become learnt from us? Or again, as Tal argues, that it is precisely with the decline of Pan-Arabism after 1967, that individual nation, that 1967, our victory is what creates the Palestinian people. It is both the living next to Zionists as well as the destruction of the multi or pan-Arab identity, that all of a sudden there is no pan-Arab identity and nation states now are coming forth, that the Palestinians are a byproduct of that. Now when we see them, do I see you through 1917 lenses and I'm still doing a Talmudic Chakira? No, there was no Palestinian people and they didn't see you as such. Do we go to the 19th and 18th century when people are arguing there's no such thing as a Jewish people? Are we obligated that when we see Palestinians, we see them the way they define themselves? That doesn't mean I have to give you sovereignty, but that means it's not a collection of individuals whose happiness is judged merely in comparison to how much money you make as distinct from everybody else's salaries. Anywhere, take a 1,000-mile radius. Are they making more money than anybody else? They have more happiness than anybody else? Or is there an understanding that now, for whatever reason, when they define themselves as a people, it obligates us? And when you have a right to self-determination, that means I see you as a nation. That means you have rights to language, education, culture, to the best of your ability, formulating and governing space within autonomy. Or are they just people? Could I just simply say, you know what? Because I don't know if you know this, that I mentioned this, I know. I just don't remember who I said what to. But in Israel, how many Arabs live between Judea and between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River depends on your politics, and it can range by over close to 2 million people. So do you say, it's like if your politics, it's 2 million up, 2 million down, how you count. Do you say, oh, there is no problem? Of course. You will just be included. We'll have 6.5 million, you'll have 5 million, and everything will be fine. Is it individuals, or is there a nation that you have to assimilate and take into account? We're debating this, and I'm not sure yet whether this could be a red line. Because I can't have a red line that 20%, is this necessary? My current feeling is yes, but I'm not sure. I'm just going to think about it for the next few years. But the right to collective rights, that means to see Palestinians the way they see themselves, the way we would want people to see us. Stop defining me as a religion and not a people. Does the obligation of reciprocity require that? And the last, and with this I conclude, is the obligation to pursue peace. How do you maintain an obligation to pursue peace at a time that you do not believe it's achievable? What happens when the consequence of your not believing that it's achievable causes you to allow within your society a profound shift in which peace ceases to be a value or an aspiration? How do you hold on to aspirations that you know that in your lifetime you can't fulfill? Yudah's going to talk more about that tomorrow. Can you hold on to something and know that you're holding on and that there's frustration? Maybe there is some sense of failure. Is it on you? Is it on them? How do you live with the dissonance between reality and your aspirations? Now, in theory, that was the essence of what it meant to be a Jew. But post-67, we don't want to live with that dissonance. I want to turn what's achievable, what is, into ought. Now, as you know, philosophically, is implies ought, or ought implies is, can, excuse me. Ought implies can, but is, or ought does not imply is. There is always a gap. How do we maintain a conversation about this? Now, for some, when you read Deuteronomy 20, I love peace. But as many of you who've learned in I Engage 3, everybody could love peace. But the peace of Deuteronomy 20 is the peace of domination. It's peace and quiet in which you live under my control. But the peace of Deuteronomy 2 is understood by the rabbis, in which Moses overrides God's commandment and says, while war is an option that you are obligating to me, I only embark on war after I have exhausted the possibility of peace. And peace includes respecting your life. 2, respecting your property. 3, respecting your national rights. 1, 2, in many ways 3 and 4 are all assumed by Moses through the rabbinic eyes. All assumed by him. And therefore he rejects the option of fighting Sichon. Because I'm obligated to 1, 2, 3, 4, and peace has to fit into that category. How to do this, I don't know. We don't sing about peace anymore. We don't write about it. If you talk about it, you'll become like Peres, irrelevant. You can hear a gabbai. What's his first name again? Avi? Beautiful, beautiful speech when he won the Labor Party's. Did he speak about peace? Zilch. Does Yair Lapid speak about peace? Zilch. Zilch. Yair Lapid, when he wants to make a strong statement upon Israeli-Palestinian relations, says, we have to build a wall so we don't have to see them. What happens when we lose our vision? What happens when we stop implementing Jewish law, which says that peace and justice are the 2 commandments that you are obligated to pursue? All of Jewish law you're obligated to keep. That means when the time happens, when the event occurs, you're supposed to implement it. What are you supposed to pursue? How do you create a society that pursues peace in the Middle East? Now, that doesn't mean that I therefore want a unilateral withdrawal. I don't want one. And it doesn't mean that I become naive. But what is the Torah of a pursuing of peace? Do you do anything that makes peace impossible? If a day will come, how do you create the preconditions? What do you do now? The notion that there's nothing that you could do now is simply false. There's a tremendous amount that you could do, because one way, as we know from Kol Dodi Dofek, one day, the biggest tragedy is that when the knock occurs, and you say, Pashatati et ktonti echal bashena, I can't do it now, and you're screaming, get out of bed! What are you, crazy? You've been hocking me a chinik about how much you love this person. Get out of bed? No, it's the wrong time. And when you get out of bed, as Salaveh, what do? Dodi chamak v'avar, it's too late. Are we prepared if there is a knock? Do we even hear? Are we within our society training our people to even want this? At the end of the day, if you don't pursue peace, you cannot probably sustain a commitment to the value of all human life. You can't. And then you become who you never wanted to become. And all of this, and with this I'll conclude, and if there's any questions, there's a tremendous amount that we could do. Not just by lessening the footprint of occupation. Not just making sure that most of our settlements are in settlement blocks. Not just simply ensuring the economic sustainability of Palestinian society. The desire to create moral guidelines or red lines is to ask all of us to not merely be politicians, but to be rabbis, cantors, and educators. And to remember that a Jewish people is a people who live by values, who define themselves by their values. And it's on us, 50 years after 1967, to raise that voice louder and louder. To raise it because many of our people are forgetting. To raise it because more and more people believe that to be pro-Israel is to give up on this aspiration. To raise it because somehow our community is being divided around moral language when that's not what needs to divide us. Good people, moral people, intelligent people could have very different answers as to whether Abu Mazen wants peace and what's possible and how you take into account the messes that which is our neighbor. But let's unite around a strong moral core, a core that values all human beings, that respects their right to property, that recognizes that as a Jew, I treat others the way I would want to be treated. That part of that, I recognize that I'm not a nation living in the midst of other individuals, but there's another people here who I have to make room for, even if it's not through sovereignty. And that I never give up my aspiration for the world as I want it to be. When we do that, then we're creating a Jewish state. Thank you. And now, no, yes, please.
Can you apply what you were talking about within the categories that we saw of Shalom and Shalom, and so what's the difference?
The question is, could you apply these categories to Kiddush Hashem and Darkei Shalom, and what's the relationship between them? I didn't spend time on this. It's in my book. I do this more on the notion of Kiddush Hashem. But Kiddush Hashem could be seen as a functional category, just like Darkei Shalom. Both of them, and you're putting them together, is very, very astute. Both of them could mean, like, as they ask in the Gemara, if there's a Chilul Hashem, or are you allowed to steal from a goy? You can't when there's a Chilul Hashem. In other words, here it is. If they know somehow, if you could do it in secret, you could really do whatever you want. And Darkei Shalom could be viewed as, we have to be nice to them out of our own self-interest, when it serves our means. And then when you have a counter-argument that it doesn't serve your means, or your needs, then you don't do so. One of the interesting things is that both Kiddush Hashem and Chilul Hashem and Darkei Shalom have two readings in the tradition. One is as functional categories, which serve either the Jewish people's self-interest or God's self-interest, or, I'll just, as I write in the book, and I think I've taught it here, I'm sure I have, but that Kiddush Hashem is God wants God's name to be sanctified because God has chosen to live in this world. That means it's not a functional category to serve God's interest. Kiddush Hashem is what enables God to fulfill God's agenda for the world. And Darkei Shalom, as the Rambam quotes, Mishum Mipnei Darkei Shalom, and then he adds, Mishum Shedarchei Darchei Noam B'chol Netivotei Shalom. The pursuit of peace is not a self-defense advocacy position. It's the highest value that we aspire for. So each one of them could both serve the more functional, as you saw, or it could be the catalyst for supporting each one of the values that I mentioned here. Yes, I'm coming. Yes, please. 2, 3. Yes.
So when I hear you speak about morality and I try to listen as an Israeli, I think you're disloyal, you're a friar, you're a smolani. Morality is weakness. How do you create a language of moral bravery that can engage that culture?
I don't know. I'm trying. Sometimes successfully and sometimes not. I remember I'm sitting here with a group it's in this room, with all the senior officers of the Central Command. And I got attacked for this, and it was one of the things that was used in a campaign to vilify the Hartman Institute. Because I asked, I said, Tzahal hu hatzava hachi musari ba'olam. Tzahal is the most moral army in the world. And I asked, why? I said, is this by definition? Because you died in the Holocaust? Or is this something has some empirical, that needs to be tested empirically? Fury. I asked, did you check Finland? And they said, Finland זה לא כלום, הם לא עומדים בפני הסכנות שאנחנו עומדים בפניהם. They're not, you can't compare us to Finland. I said, okay. I appreciate that. Any other army? There's no army in the world, this is what's no army in the world which endangers its soldiers to limit civilian casualties. I said, did you check that? No, really? Britain, United States, they don't take into account civilian casualties. That's not an issue. But part of the problem is that the declaration is made. And I asked him, really? Did you ever? He says, then that same person says, do you know מה? צה"ל הוא הצבא הכי מוסרי בעולם, משום כשאנחנו אומרים את זה, זה היעד שלנו. This is when you say it, and I said, so there's moments when I succeed. There were a bunch of people in the room who still hated me. Part of the problem we face right now is exactly, and I don't want to overstate it, because you're not always a Smolani, it's not as if Israeli society is now in some tremendous moral cesspool. We're dancing next to it, but we're not there. And then you count your victories. And that's why, educationally, this institute is working so hard on Israeli Arabs and on refugees, because if we can, that's the one that we could fix quicker. And then we can, to start with the rights is very, very difficult. But we could start. Azaria was a moment. The people who live by what I just said more than any other group in Israeli society is the military. And for the first time in Israeli society, there has been a vilification of the military. Never before. It used to be the Supreme Court. The military was subject to the same delegitimization as the Supreme Court. It was remarkable. And what I am furious at Prime Minister Netanyahu for, even though I think there's many things that he does well and many things that he does not, but what I'm furious is that for the first time, he did not go to the defense of the military. He did it every single time. The minute Bughi Ya'alon left his coalition, a completely different set of behaviors and principles were put into place, and he no longer is going to take any position that will undermine the possible stability of his coalition so as to ensure that he can continue to remain prime minister, because, as I said, he sees himself as the greatest strategic asset. Now, part of that process is to allow this conversation. Rivlin fights it. Part of what I say this to the whole Jewish renewal movement, is that we have failed. Because right now, there's a lot of Kabbalot Shabbat, and there's a lot of Nigunim, and there's a lot of Slichot and Piyutim. Avichai will give you Piyutim, from Bet Avichai will give you Piyutim from now till kingdom come, until you can't hear anymore. Piyutim programs, Parshat Shavuot, all of that is great. But what are the values that we're fighting for? We have to switch. There's an army here that is not prepared, that needs to be activated towards this, and it's very difficult. But part of our job is we're doing it because we know it's difficult. Otherwise, I could shut down the Hartman Institute and I could retire. I'm 58, but soon. It's not good. Unfortunately, we're not there yet. But it's now one of the things that you need to do, and if you noticed, I did one of them today. And that is to separate this from the one-state, two-state conversation. If you don't separate it from that, you are irrelevant. The moral discourse is perceived to be a political discourse instead of a moral discourse. We have to bring it back. It's a moral discourse. And it has nothing to do with the politics. That's why that mantra that I say over and over again. And the second thing is that the minute Israelis believe that you are belittling their fear, they cannot hear anything that you say. And so it's here you get the catch. I'll call it, Micha spoke about the catch 67. I'll call it the catch Lapid. This is the Lapid catch. I want to make sure that Israelis understand that I respect their fear. And therefore I don't say, like Bushi would say 2 years ago, I know Abu Mazen well, and if I'm prime minister, I'll have peace. Or a president of the United States could say, we're going to make a deal and it's going to be really easy. The minute you do that, people don't listen to you. But the problem is that how do you reaffirm the fear, but also speak a moral conversation? And to tell you that I know how to do it, I don't. I just know that I have to. And hopefully I'll find some wisdom. Yes, please, sir. And then, ma'am.
I spent a little time with people who are living in the territories. I like them. I really love many things. I really feel that they're my sisters and brothers. I also think that quite a few of them, either explicitly or implicitly, would deny your first principle. They would choose the texts that you introduced as probably abhorrent to many of us. How would you draw your red line there and say,
Yes.
no, you're on the outside?
Yes.
You would.
Yes. The vast, vast majority of, first of all, there is no such thing as settlers. We talk about this all the time.
No such thing as
Settlers. There's no such thing as settlers. Because who's a settler? 80% of those people living across the green lines are living in major cities, have gone so at the encouragement of the state of Israel. They're living in a town, they don't see themselves as ideologic. So this notion that there's this group called settlers. The vast, 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 vast majority, and I'm talking in the 95 pluses, ascribe to the value of human life. And you can see it not in theory, you can see it in the way they act. The challenge is that very often, when you have fear, leadership speaks in another word, and they think you're going to speak down to the people, and therefore you will be their leader. There are lots of Jewish texts that support it, and they're learned. They're learned. They're texts that you've never even heard of, you've never seen, and you would never even meet, and here they're self-evident. But that, I believe, is winnable. But again, you have to work on it. But it's winnable on some level. But the deeper corruption, and again, it's not just the fact that other people do it too doesn't help me. But how are Muslims treated? What is it like to be an African American? There's just a moment that I'll share with you. We had an MLI retreat right after Trump was elected. It was 3 days after Trump was elected. We had a retreat in which, 65 out of 70 MLIers all came to this retreat together. And it was a very remarkable moment because we might have disagreed about Trump. Jews still were safe in America. And here you were in the midst of a group of people who now felt, could I live in America? Will I ever be able to see my family again? And one Muslim scholar from north of Orlando, I forget the city, said, I wonder when America will be embarrassed of its racism. When is the moment that America is going to become embarrassed? And at that moment, there's silence in the room, and it came from this pain. And then there's this chair that screeches as it's moved back. And a 6'8" African-American Muslim, who's one of the lead imams in Minneapolis, he says, what are you talking about? When will America be embarrassed? What do you think my life is? Now you've discovered? And he starts talking about his fear every time his child leaves the house. And you're angry at me because I'm trying to speak about Black Lives Matter and somehow I'm inconvenienced. And I'm not getting into whether it's connected to BDS and intersectionality. We're not talking about that right now. And he's like, and everybody just. And I say, I apologize to you. He says, what, you didn't know? I say, I didn't know. And in our tradition, what you have to do is you do tshuva. Should I have known? Our ability to develop societies in which not all human life is equal is one of the most embarrassing things about human society. And the one thing that we have to recognize is that a Jewish society is not immune from it. It's not immune from it. And our goal is not to divide between right wing and left wing or settlers. Part of my whole language is this is a tent that we could all be in. It could respect your commitment to Eretz Yisrael. It could respect your commitment to Israel's security. But are you taking stands that you don't need to take? That is an educational journey that I hope will help. Last question, and then we're going to conclude, and then we'll have those of you who want will be able to talk after lunch. Yes, please.
This follows up a little bit on what you were saying, but I wanted to ask you a little more about the philosophy understanding. So, from the sources that we read through, and it really sounds like, and I'm sort of agree with this, but so we like these texts better than we like those texts.
Yes.
So, but how do you, when you're within the halakha, is it difficult? I mean, there's a very strong scrutiny that all these texts will only apply to Jews. So now we don't like that, we don't agree with that, but it's, you just throw that out the window?
No, first of all, you can't, if you throw it out the window, you're unprepared to recognize what somebody else is learning and quoting.
Right.
So first, by throwing it out the window, it doesn't go away, it actually grows much, much stronger. Whether you use the word of cultural war that I spoke about, or what Benny said yesterday, Benny Lau spoke about journey, that's part of our process. Part of our process, and it's a nice way to end this class with my father's Torah. He always said that one of the great gifts of Israel is that it forces us to give up all our fantasies about Judaism and the Jewish people. We have problems here. And we're in the midst of struggles, battles, journeys. To what extent world Jewry, those in Israel and around the world, can have a shared moral aspiration. And part of it will be to say, I will never say to you, you're not part of Judaism, and I'll never say to you, you're not part of halakha, but I will say to you, you're not part of my moral community. And can we create a moral community that lets go of our political lines? We love our political lines. We love them. Can we let that go, but know fully well that at the end, if somebody's going to stand here, then excuse me, you're not part of my Jewish community. And it's true, part of those people, that's the same definition of Chassid Shoteh. The Talmud recognizes that somebody could be a Chassid Shoteh, that you could be, or more accurately, a Naval Birshut HaTorah. We just have to reclaim that discussion, and we just have to do one thing. We have to win. Thank you.